These are the lecture notes for Chapter 25 on ecology, and the focus is on community and ecosystem ecology. We are going to focus on the first three sections. Section 1, you're probably going to, in fact, for most of this chapter, it's a good chapter to end the semester with because this is probably a review to some extent. A lot of us watch, even if you don't count science classes that you've taken in school, many people watch like Discovery programs and shows and YouTube videos of animals and just nature shows, that kind of thing. So we tend to have a lot of this background, and so some of this information should be reviewed for you. Section 1 and 2 are both on communities, and Section 3 is on dynamics of an ecosystem. In other words, the interactions between different species and how their population levels affect other population levels, that kind of thing. So let's make sure that we all understand the definition of a community. We learned that in Bio 111 in the very first chapter, because when we're learning the levels of organization, after you learn about populations, a population is members of the same species living in a habitat together. Well, the community is all the populations in that ecosystem or in that location that live within that same habitat. It's all of the living things. So it includes all the plants, all the fungi, the bacteria, all the microorganisms, and the animals, of course. So a community is an assemblage of populations of different species interacting with one another within the same environment. Another way to look at it is we define an ecosystem as the community plus the habitat, the community being all the living things and the habitat being all the non-living things. So although there are a few examples of living things being the habitat for other living things, but, like, for example, humans are the habitat for all these bacteria that live inside of our GI tract. But anyway, for the most part, the non-living things would be the habitat and the living things would be the community. When we study communities, we look at some data. The species richness just lets us know the number of different species that live in that community or that are part of that community, the number of different species that make up that community. But to really consider species diversity, we don't just look at the number of different species, but we look at the abundance of each species as compared to the other. So the relative abundances of the different species. The example that's given, if you did the reading, I don't mean to laugh, but a lot of students don't like to read the chapters, but if you did read the chapter in your e-text, the example that's given there is like there's a forest that contains one elm tree and like 20 birch trees, whereas this other forest contains 20 birch trees and 20 elm trees. So the one that contains 20 elm trees and 20 birch trees has the greater species diversity. The one that contains 20 birch trees and one elm tree, you might walk through the whole forest and not see that elm tree, but in the other forest you see more variety, So that's what we're looking at when we talk about species richness, species diversity, and that kind of thing. So you have a picture on the left of what's called a coniferous forest, like you see in Canada. I'm not sure where this is. It probably tells you down here. But anyway, it's a coniferous forest. It's colder here, and you have a lot of conifers, a lot of evergreens. You see the mountains in the background that, are covered in snow in some places. But then you have a tropical forest on the right. So the species is described by the types, the community is described by the types of species that live there. And in the coniferous forest, you have squirrels, moose, snowshoe hare, bear, red fox, wolves, and those are some of the different animal species that live there. That doesn't even include the fact that you see all of these evergreen trees, that dominate the plant life of the forest. Then you have the tropical rainforest, and this animal on the right is called a kinkajou, I guess is how you say that, or kinkajou. I'm really not sure. Maybe you could Google the pronunciation if you wanted to know. I'm not familiar with it. But I am familiar with a sloth, and you see the sloth here on the left. And there's other animals that species that make up the tropical rainforest, and this kind of helps us define that ecosystem is the species that live there. You have monkeys, anteaters, jaguars, tapir, bat, sloth, so the species composition really defines the ecosystem. In other words, the species that live in that ecosystem kind of define it. The species diversity, again, is a listing of the species in a community so that's the species richness, along with the relative abundance of each species. So the greater the species richness and the more even the distribution, then we say that there is greater species diversity. A few other terms that you need to be familiar with when we do talk about ecosystems and communities. The habitat is just the area, the location where an organism lives and reproduces. When we use the word niche, the niche is the role that the organism plays in its community. So that's going to include the methods that it uses to meet its energy needs, its nutrient needs, and its survival demands. So when we say things like consumer and producer and autotroph and heterotroph and predator and prey, these are ways of describing the niche. But also when we talk about the habitat where that organism, spends most of its time, that's part of its niche as well. So there's two types of niche. There's the fundamental niche, which is basically, if you look at it this way, if that organism was living with no limits on its space that it could, its habitat that it could live in, that it could occupy, the food that it could eat, if there were no limits, there was no competition, there was nothing trying to eat that particular organism, no limits to its survival, that would be its fundamental niche. But most organisms have limits on what they can eat and where they can live, and that's their realized niche. That's their actual set of conditions under which they exist in nature. When there are no adverse biotic conditions present, there are no predators out to get them, there are no other species that are competing with them. So if you look at it that way, the fundamental niche is always larger than the realized niche. So the realized niche is their actual niche. And here's an example. I cannot remember his name, but there's a scientist who basically his research led to the competitive exclusion principle. So it's a principle that explains a little bit about the role of competition. He did this experiment, and these experiments were done in test tubes in the laboratory. He grew, and paramecium are protozoans within the kingdom Protista. They have cilia that covers, they're unicellular, but they have cilia that covers their plasma membrane. And the cilia help them to swim and it helped them to feed because it helps them to filter food, from the water. They are freshwater Anyway, there are two species. He grew Paramecium aurelia. I'm sorry about that. He grew Paramecium aurelia in a test tube, gave them a certain amount of food, and they had this typical population growth curve that you see with microorganisms. They started out small, grew exponentially, and then sort of leveled off. You know, their population leveled off at a certain number and kind of remained stable. He also grew a separate species of Paramecium in another test tube and saw similar results. You know, their population leveled off after a while, remained stable. Then he grew them together, and because of competition and because the Paramecium aurelia had a competitive, you know, advantage, the aurelia outcompeted the caudatum, and the caudatum died. You know, it completely killed off the population of caudatum. But this happened in a test tube when he grew them together. Test tubes don't always reflect real life. What normally happens in nature is, okay, so let's just go over the definitions and then I'll tell you. The competitive exclusion principle, which is what this test tube experiment with the Paramecium, you know, kind of led to, says that no two species can indefinitely occupy the same niche at the same time. But instead of one species outcompeting the other and making the other species go basically extinct, what normally happens is something called resource partitioning. In real life, not test tubes, species are typically, one will outcompete the other. And the species that is outcompeted will find another niche somehow. You know, that it's resource partitioning is the apportioning of resources in order to decrease competition between species. So resource partitioning leads to niche specialization and less niche overlap between species. Owls and hawks are a very common example of this. They both eat the same food. They are predators, both of them, and you know, they eat little rabbits and mice and little rodents. You know, they are hunters. But instead of their niche overlapping and them competing with each other, hawks have wonderful eyesight. They hunt during the day. Owls hunt at night. So they're not competing really at all. And that's due to resource partitioning. But if this experiment were done in a lab, maybe, you know, who knows how it would turn out. So lab experiments are good, but they don't always tell the whole story. Down at the bottom, character displacement says that characteristics of organisms tend to become more divergent, more different when populations belong to the same community than when they are isolated. And there's an example of the barnacles on the Scottish coast. So let's talk about those first, and then we'll go back to those other slides. There's a large barnacle called Balanus, and then there's a small barnacle called Thamylus. The CH is silent. These are two hard words to say. That basically, when they're not competing with each other, the small barnacles can grow in all of these depths of water. They can grow in the high tide and they can grow in the low tide area of that rock. But when the larger barnacles, Balanus, come in and there is competition, it kind of pushes the Thamylus up to the high tide region. There is a region where they both reside called the area of competition, but mostly you see the larger ones in the deeper water and then the smaller ones in the shallow water where only, you know, where the high tide reaches. And that's what has happened due to competition. The fundamental niche of the Thamylus, or the small barnacle, is actually the entire region from low tide to high tide. But the realized niche is pretty much the high tide region of the water, you know. So that's an example of fundamental versus realized. Now, we also have these finches that live on the Galapagos Islands. You know about their beaks probably from natural selection, because you know, we use that as evidence of natural selection, is that we see finches whose beaks are different compared to, you know, based on their food source. But this is data that's not really related so much to that. It's showing us a little bit of a different thing. What we find when you have a finch that lives alone on an island and doesn't share the island with another finch, that finch tends to have an intermediate size beak. Here are the three sizes of beaks. You have the small beak and the medium and intermediate, and then the large, deeper beak, I guess you say, the larger, thicker beak. What we tend to see is that no matter what the species, most of the finches will have this intermediate size beak, and they'll tend to eat small seeds. So this is showing you small, medium, and large food in the form of seeds. So when they live alone, no matter what the species, they tend to have an intermediate beak, and they tend to feed on the small seeds. But when they coexist, and there are 4 islands where they live together, when the data was collected, it was found that you would have some that had small beaks, some that had intermediate sized beaks, and some that had large beaks. And they would feed on small, medium, and large seeds. And so this top graph would represent their realized niche, and then these would be their fundamental niches. The middle and bottom graph would be the fundamental niches of the G. fortis and the G. Fulliginosa. And this graph here is just showing you that there are birds called warblers, and in the blue shows you for each warbler species where they actually, even though they live in the same tree, they frequently they'll remain, you know, in certain parts of the tree. That's where they'll feed, and that's where they'll kind of live. They'll spend most of their time in the area of the tree that's shaded in blue. And so they all share the tree. That's resource partitioning.